My name is Jay Sugarman, and I want to welcome you to Innovation Showcase. The main purpose of this ongoing series is to inform viewers about exciting innovations and creative individuals across the fields of business, science, technology, education, and the arts. Today, via Zoom, we're fortunate to have as our guest Joe Wallace. Joe is a highly accomplished journalist, photographer, and storyteller, and he's here today to share with us his recently published book entitled The Day After Yesterday: Resilience in the Face of Dementia. The book is an outgrowth of his traveling exhibition featuring photographs and accompanying narratives of a range of individuals with Alzheimer's or another type of dementia. During the program, we're finding out why and how the traveling exhibition and subsequent book came about. We'll view and learn about some of the individuals featured in the book, and in the process come to better understand dementia and the wide range of individuals dealing with this condition. Let's start by meeting Joe and then learning all about the day after yesterday: resilience in the face of dementia. Welcome, Joe. So delighted you're able to be here again.
Thank you, Jay. It's great to see you. Thank you for having me on your show. I'm very happy to be here.
First of all, congratulations on building upon the traveling exhibition and creating such a moving and informative book. I'm eager to hear what's transpired since we first spoke 4 years ago and then have you inform viewers. But before we jump right to that, just very briefly, could you remind us a little bit about your background, professional interest, and then how led to your focus on Alzheimer's and dementia, please?
Sure. So I'm a photographer. I've been a professional photographer for over 20 years. Prior to that, I worked in marketing and advertising for the first 10 years of my career. And I got interested in this project after my mother's parents both had dementia. One had Alzheimer's and one had vascular dementia. Great. Thank you for bringing this picture up. This is my mother is the baby, and her parents, Elizabeth and Joe Jenkins, or Granddaddy Joe, and BB, as I would call them. Granddaddy had Alzheimer's and BB had vascular dementia. My mother has been participating in a study at the Brigham. She does not have an official diagnosis yet, but she has some of the genetic markers indicating a predisposition to Alzheimer's. If you go to the next picture, so my journey began on this day in this picture. So I got a phone call from my mother that Granddaddy had a heart attack, and could I please make my way to Birmingham, Alabama to help? So I got on an airplane and I went to Birmingham, and this is the place I spent a lot of time as a kid. I was very close to my grandparents. And the good news was that Granddaddy was going to survive his heart attack. The surprising news was that when he was in the hospital, it became very clear very quickly that he had significant cognitive decline and was diagnosed with Alzheimer's, and he had been successfully masking his disease from his wife and his neighbors and community. The next day, my mother and BB went to go on a series of healthcare visits, and I was asked to spend the day with Granddaddy Joe. And the reason I bring this up is because I was scared. This is somebody that I had loved and admired my whole life. I'd had a really close relationship with, but somebody said the word Alzheimer's, and I didn't know what that was. I didn't know how it was going to affect our relationship. Was he going to remember me? And the short story is that we had one of the most memorable days that we had ever spent together. We spent the day talking, laughing, and him sharing stories with me. And 20 years later, I have a deep sadness that I only have that memory, and that I wish that I had recorded those stories, which was part of the reason that I began this project later. If you go to the next picture, you'll see this is about 15 years later. I'm married, I have kids of my own. My grandmother lived with my aunt, then my parents, then into a nursing home. And again, the reason I show this picture is because, again, I was faced with my own stigma and stereotype. I would visit my grandmother often, but I didn't want to engage in that community. I didn't want to meet people. I went in with the belief that I didn't have anything in common with the people there, and I stood nothing to gain from it. And I just wanted to focus on my time with my grandmother. And I could not have been more wrong. And I like to start with my own stigma, because most of my work is about changing people's perceptions on what living with dementia looks like. So I want to share my own journey.
And you took your journey yourself and then created this traveling exhibition, which, for those who haven't had the chance to see it in person yet, could you just share briefly how that came about and the intent?
So it started as a traveling exhibit back in 2018, and it's been traveling in New England. It's also been most recently at Duke University. It's now at the Nicolaitan Art Museum in Wyoming.
Hmm.
And as you can see from this photo, it's two basic components. It's a portrait of the person that I take after a lengthy interview and discussion, coupled with a story that I write about the anecdotes that are shared with me, and a small photograph of that individual when they were 15 to 25 years old. And the purpose of the exhibit, as well as the book, which we'll get to in a minute, is to destigmatize those living with disease, to add a more complex narrative. I like to say that some of the media try to oversimplify things, and you might be delivered the bookends of, on one side, you may get saccharine, right? A picture of someone singing to their grandmother through the window during COVID. And on the other end, you might get a train wreck. You might get someone sitting in a wheelchair, nonverbal, drooling, a picture of despair. And while both of those things may be real in some circumstances, 99% of the experience of living with dementia is between those things. And I'm trying to show a compelling story, real stories, that show the hardship and the difficulty, but also the love and the dignity and the vitality that always remain.
No, and you definitely accomplished that, and relatively short vignettes that captured the sort of summary of your sessions and conversations with the individuals and their caregivers, which is another nice feature of the book, is including their voices in this whole experience. Just adds that added dimension for those of us just trying to learn more and more and be sort of cognizant of what's involved with Alzheimer's and dementia.
Thank you.
And we can start here with just sharing, what was the leap from the exhibition to then conceptualizing and deciding to put it together in a book, and the steps and the process that went about?
Sorry, I'm having a technical issue where I have tried to, my screen is minimized and I can no longer see the images. So let me see if I can resolve that. My apologies.
Sure. No, we'll be able to make a
Hmm.
quick snip in post-production. Take your time.
So they're very small. Okay. So
I can I can just repeat that for a second.
yeah, sorry. Okay, I'm ready. If you want to repeat the question.
Yeah, just briefly. Joe, how did you go about from the traveling exhibition to conceptualizing and the process involved in creating the book and deciding on who to include? A little bit about those logistics.
I think I knew after 2 or 3 days of interviewing people that this was going to be incredibly powerful, and much more so than I had anticipated. And the catharsis that people had in sharing with me, and the amount of intimacy and immediacy, and the rawness of the emotion was evident from the very beginning. And that made me want to dig in and work harder. It made me feel incredibly grateful for everything that was shared with me. And each time I added another story, it sort of grew the circle of value, of trust, of opportunity. And each time I shared what I was doing, it was this cascade of other people sharing their stories with me. And it became evident that there was this deep need for this kind of storytelling, because so many people had stories that they had previously not shared. And there was this, a thirst that I knew I had, but I didn't know so many others had. And that was the fuel to keep working on this.
No, that sense of trust that you developed is really a powerful first impression that I got after reading just one or two of the vignettes, and the participants' willingness, openness, eagerness to share their life story with you truly is one of the strengths of the book. And the time remaining, we want to hear about some of those individuals, even though rather briefly. And the first one is gentleman here, Mike Belleville.
So Mike Belleville is an incredible advocate. He's very outspoken. He's very opinionated. He's a riveting speaker and an incredible human being. And I'm just going to share a little bit of a snippet. Again, I pair a picture of the subject when they were younger with where they are now, because one of the stigmas is people feel defined by their diagnosis. And so showing the two images is a way to visually force people to consider the whole person and their lifetime of experiences, not just this moment in time. So that's why there's the two photographs. So Mike says, I'm just going to read you a portion of the story. The biggest thing for me is stigma. It's because of what people think or what they anticipate, what they see as dementia. The public narrative is tragedy. As soon as you get a diagnosis, you're automatically put in this pool as a person who's no longer capable. It's automatic. It's like, pow, you're in this bucket now. You're no longer capable of making decisions for yourself. You're no longer capable of participating. These are all the things that you can't do anymore, and it makes me very frustrated and angry. I want people to understand that you can still live a meaningful, purposeful life with what time you have. Don't believe the narrative that life is over. I want my voice to help get people to treat us the same as they did before we got the diagnosis. We may change some, but we are still the same people. Talk to us. We're still here.
Mike is so eloquent and speaks for so many of the other participants with a similar message for sure, but nobody, I don't think, says it as strongly or better than Mike indeed. Moving on to another individual who we'll find out was the cover of the book, Juanita Peterson, please. A few words about this former clinical psychologist.
Yes, she grew up in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. She moved in with her sister in New York City. She got a degree from City College and then put herself through NYU. Got a PhD, was a clinical practitioner at Bellevue, spent her whole life helping other people, is what I would say. And she said to me, when I asked her, how does it feel to have dementia? And she said, it feels awful. Let me tell you, it feels like part of my life has been cut off and I can't get it back. I feel really sad. The other day, I couldn't remember my husband Al's birthday. How could I forget that? It's frightening that you couldn't remember things that were so important to you. Juanita's story is really powerful. She's an incredibly kind and generous person, despite her struggles with dementia. And, we met 3 times. The first 2 times we had a nice conversation and she said, I don't like the way I look today. Can we do this another day? And the third time, I said, Juanita, this is the 3rd time we've had this conversation. Do you mind? And she said, oh, I'm sorry. Of course, we should do it. We should do it now. She's very sweet. And she has a lovely relationship with her daughter, Lisa. She's had to move in with her, and they have a very openness about difficult it is. Juanita feels humiliated by having to live with her daughter, but she's also at the same time incredibly grateful and realizes that she couldn't do it without her help. So that's one of the raw moments of the interviews that are so beautiful, is that people are honest about how difficult it is, but also how wonderful it is at the same time. And to have those two things of equal importance, I think is really a special part of this
I think the changing dynamics in the relationships, whether it's spouse or family, comes up a number of times. One very powerfully is with Larry Bales and his family. A few words about Larry.
So Larry, at the time of the photograph, was 50. At the time, it was the youngest person that I had photographed. And the first time I had done an interview with a whole family, I was with his wife, Allison, his daughter, Zoe, and son, Brendan. I think that they are 7 and 12 in this photograph. And so an anecdote about that is I was super nervous to interview children, but what I learned very quickly is that kids are incredibly resilient, probably more so than a lot of adults. And that was really special to see. I've shared this work with lots of kids and high school students, and I always make sure to share this story to give credit to how compassionate kids can be, because I think that gives them agency and wanting to affect people that are in their lives, maybe grandparents that are going through this now. Larry was an acting coach and teacher. He was laid off because he started struggling with work. And then he got the diagnosis. So Allison talks about how getting the diagnosis, although it didn't solve any problems, it at least gave her perspective on what was going on and why there were so many emotional struggles between Larry and work and Larry and his family. And that enabled them to be compassionate and also understand and get the help they needed on how to help Larry and how to continue forward as a family. One of the anecdotes that they shared with me, which I love, is out of their times of struggle and learning to focus on the present and the positive, which is a great life skill for anyone, they created what they call a joy jar. So they have they went out and bought a special little jar, and they wrote joy on the outside, and they have special papers, and they tell each other, whenever you've had a special moment where you got an A on a test, or somebody said something nice to you, or something really nice happened, you write it down on the piece of paper and you put it in the jar. And then in times of need, if you've had a bad day, everyone sits at the table, and each person draws one of these anecdotes out of the jar, and it gives them fuel to get through a hard day. It's just it's a beautiful story. And coincidentally, my daughter, whose name is also Zoe, created a joy jar for me, which I have on my desk.
Fabulous. Yeah. Wonderful resource for any of us. Yeah. And then very quickly, because we definitely want to move on to a couple more individuals, sure. The little instance that led to the title for the book with Larry involved.
So Larry they were having a family discussion where they were talking about dates and times and trying to manage their calendar, and something came up, and Larry was like, that's the day after yesterday. And they were like, Dad, that's today. And I love the metaphor about being in the present. And I love that this was a moment of levity for the family. And an outsider might interpret that as, oh man, Dad's really struggling. But what really happened was that it was a moment of joy, and they all laughed together, and they were able to see Larry as he is, struggling to communicate and remember things, but still very much their father. And so that's why it's the title. It was just a really cool moment in the interview that stood out.
Definitely. Another one.
That's Larry's portrait. He struggles to communicate, and so we did a lot of sort of gesture, and I always talk to my subjects first to build trust in a relationship, so I can get a expression that's authentic.
Mm-hmm. Well, moving on to this next individual and younger phase of her life, Helen Tung.
So Helen Tung, I love this photograph. She was 100 years old when I photographed her. And I interviewed Helen and her daughter. Helen only speaks Cantonese, so thankfully her daughter was there to help me. And the takeaway that I like to share, she is a really joyful moment. It's important to show these incredibly nice moments. So 100 years old, she lived in China. She was chased from her home when the Japanese invaded in the 30s. She had to flee to Taiwan during the Cultural Revolution and didn't see part of her family for over 30 years. She ultimately immigrated to the United States to be with her daughters, who came to college here in Philadelphia. She was a midwife in Taiwan. She delivered hundreds of babies. She almost died from typhoid fever. Incredible, absolutely incredible lifetime, which I could spend an hour talking about. But at the end of our interview, I said to Helen and her daughter, I said, "You've lived this incredible life. What's the secret? What does it all mean? What would you want to say to a young person? Like, what's the secret sauce of life?" And it's really important that she didn't talk about her job. She didn't talk about how much money she made. She didn't talk about her car, her occupation, money. The things that were the most important to her was her family, the tradition of how they celebrated Chinese New Year together, the lullaby that her grandmother used to sing to her. It was all these just incredibly real, authentic moments that are the most valuable. And I love sharing that, again, sharing that story with young people who are having their heads filled with, getting a job and succeeding and all these things that it's, let me just tell you what happens if you live to 100. None of that stuff matters anymore. So
no, very true. No, the positive nature of her and her family really rung true. Want to hear a few words about journalist Greg O'Brien.
Greg, number one, I would say read his book if you have someone that you love in your life, or you yourself are experiencing living with Alzheimer's. His book is called On Pluto: Inside the Mind of Alzheimer's. His strength is that he's incredibly raw, unedited, and also hilarious and warm and welcoming and inclusive. And he can have this incredible range of emotion and still keep it all together and make you feel included and special. So he's an incredible writer and speaker. He wrote an essay for the book, and I can read a snippet for you, or we can move forward.
Let's hear, I mean, his whole essay is well worth reading, but a little snippet would be wonderful, and then we'll move on.
He said, "Stephen King could not have designed a better plot for a sickness that slowly steals the mind, then pilfers the body, then robs your finances, pushing families like mine to bankruptcy. Then there's the depression that seems to have no bottom, and the flirts with suicide, and yet Alzheimer's can't take your soul. Our minds in many ways are like iPhones, still sophisticated devices, but with a short-term battery that pocket dials and gets lost easily."
I loved that.
It's a great example of how he can talk about the rawness of what feels like despair sometimes, and still have his humanity and his dignity and his sense of humor and his deep sense of faith. He can hold all of that. And it's, I think it's just a really important example for other people that are experiencing living with dementia.
Most definitely, most definitely. One point you make towards the end of the book is a situation you refer to as moments of grace. Would you please just share the intent with that and importance?
So oftentimes I'm interviewing, if people are further along with their dementia diagnosis, they may be struggling to speak, to feel present, right? So oftentimes in those circumstances, I'm interviewing multiple people at once. It could be a spouse, it could be a child, and a person may have a moment of lucidity where they're suddenly incredibly present and conversant. I don't have the picture here, but I photographed a woman named Anya Walsh, and I was in the room with her and three of her daughters, and they were jokingly saying how she's from Moycullen, Ireland, and she used to joke that to Americanize, she swore off Irish men And she ended up, ironically, meeting, falling in love, and marrying a man in Lowell, Massachusetts, who was from Moycullen. And they're all laughing about it. And suddenly, Anya, their mother, who'd been in the room the whole time and not speaking, opened her eyes and told the story about how she met her husband and how they went on their first date. And she hadn't spoken in an hour. And that's an example of a moment of grace. And they, you know, when you're spending time with somebody who may not be responding in a way that you're used to or yearning for, those moments are so precious. People will spend all day together just waiting for that moment.
You know, while we don't have time to hear more individual stories, I'm gonna roll up some images as we just chat about one or two final questions. And
Sure.
one is, I know you've just finished the book. It's just fresh out in the market, available for people to purchase. But what are some of your thoughts about taking this project and continuing with it, developing it even more so?
My hope is to continue using it as a catalyst for conversation, and it's meant to be a conversation starter. It's served best when it goes along with, let's say, a support group, caregiver training, you know, forums. I presented to social work students at Boston College. I went to a healthcare conference at Duke University. It's meant to make a hard conversation easier, to make people feel not alone. So my hope is to continue supporting the work by sharing it and getting other people to also share. Maybe not necessarily in this format, but if it tips the scales to making this easier and so people can share, right? One of the cruelest ironies is if you consider 55 million people globally have been diagnosed with dementia, and yet so many people feel invisible and alone. That's very sad, but that is something that we should be able to dramatically improve.
Most definitely. And the work that you've created with the participants, the collaborators, definitely takes us a step towards that goal. Just want to thank you again so much, Joe, for taking time to inform us about your work, the book, the project. I can't speak for it enough. It just adds so much to one's understanding of the topic, the empathy, the understanding, the importance of hearing individual stories, and the powerful message and insight that people of all backgrounds and levels can share with us. Definitely going to start a joy jar at home after reading and hearing from you. A true pleasure again, Joe, and continued success with your work.
Thank you so much, Jay. I really appreciate you having me on the show. Thank you.
Also want to thank those of you watching for joining us and hope you'll be able to tune in next time.